begin from this. So we're doing November 2020. We did June 2020 before, June 2021 before. So this is November 2020. The data response is missing for this, so we can skip it. But let's look at the questions, which is the section B. So this paper we only do section B, and the first question that I want to do is 3A and 3B. Okay, so let's start with 3A and 3B. Please stop me if there's any issue, anything that happens. So let's start with 3A. Okay, guys, 3A is a good question, and the reason why I'm doing it is because I think it's going to be useful for us to understand the concept of the role of marginal cost, and then saying average cost in determining the profit. So what is profit? If you look at profit, profit is simply somebody saying something just quickly. Yep, Cambridge must have plagiarized this. So yeah, maybe. So profit is revenue minus cost. So symbol for profit is this. We say this, that when you look at for a firm, the profit maximization. So this is the concept we talk about. Profit maximization happens at MC equals to MR. And we can draw a case here, which starts off by first explaining the concept that when you look at MC equals to MR, and let's say demand curve is our perfectly elastic one, demand is by MR, which is equal to price. We draw our marginal cost, right? MC equals to MR means Q naught will be the quantity. Now, why is MC equals to MR profit maximizing level of output? So we can say this, that before Q naught, MR is greater than MC, which would mean the extra profit is positive, and that's why your total profit is going up. So this is my quantity and price. But after Q naught, we can say MR is less than MC, or marginal profit is negative, and that's why total profit falls. But at this point, MC equals to MR, your total profit is maximum. So we begin our discussion by first talking about the role of MC equals to MR. And we talk about basically the role of marginal cost in determining profit. So basically what we say is this, that MC equals to MR tells us what output is, or what level of output is maximizing profits. Does that make sense, guys? Once we know this, then we talk about, okay, now that we know that Q naught is maximizing our profit, basically then comes the role of ATC. ATC will tell us how much profit. So we know this, the equation for profit is revenue minus cost is profit. Or in other words, if I divide this by Q, I can say P, revenue is P times Q over Q, minus C over Q is ATC, is equal to profit per unit. So your price minus ATC is your profit per unit. So we can talk about this, that the role of ATC is simply the idea that it will tell us how much profit will a firm make. So this applies to even imperfect competition. The only thing that is different here, Ahmed, is the idea the demand curve I'm making is downward, not downward sloping, but a perfectly elastic demand curve. Okay, so P minus ATC is the case for every firm, and MC equals to MR is the case for all firms, be it perfect competition or monopoly. Constant price, yeah. The only thing that is different here is that it's right that the price is constant versus Yes, I will upload this. That's why we're recording it. And who else is saying something? Can we mention the point the firms are making normal profit, workers hire will increase? I don't know. Normal profit is not something we'll talk about right now. But what we'll do is basically, then we put it on the graph. We'll say this, that. So once we know this, that this is my demand curve, which is, for example, is equal to my MR, is equal to my price. This is my ATC. I'm sorry, this is my MC. And I know I'm making Q naught. And this is my price. Now ATC in the short run, if price is greater than ATC, we make a normal, supernormal profit like this one. So you can say this, that in the short run, we have three situations for profit. Your supernormal profit. I apologize for my handwriting. Let me just make it slightly. Your super normal profit. Then we have your normal profit. And you have your economic loss. Supernormal profit price is greater than ATC. Normal profit price is equal to ATC. And economic loss price is less than ATC. Okay, guys. So can we make a diagram for imperfect? Yes, you can make a diagram for imperfect. That will be perfectly okay. So then we talk about, guys, that this in the long run, however, since all costs are variable, we can say the price has to be equal to ATC for firms to stay in the business. Got it? So you can then talk about this idea. So let me label this properly. Are you all with me? Does that make sense, guys? So this is a good question because it's a straightforward question. So you have your no, Madhya, this holds true for all firms. This part of our theory holds true for all firms. Under monopoly, you can make a loss, and if you are making a loss, you might decide not to continue your business. There could be a possibility, like for example, Pakistan Steel Mill is a monopoly, but was making losses even in the long run, and the government then thinks about, should they continue or should they shut down and so on. Okay, guys, one more thing which I wanted to talk about is this, that yeah, you do need to mention your definitions of marginal cost and your average total cost. Average total cost is total cost over quantity or cost per unit, and your marginal cost is the extra cost of producing one additional unit. Dead by now? Yeah. Even my example is dead for sure, Sumit. The steel mill example is a dated example for sure. I completely agree with you on that. Okay, guys, does that make sense? 3A. You'll be like, Sir Aliam Zada is doing micro questions when he's so pro macro when it comes to questions, is because I feel this is one part. If you know your theory of firm, it actually serves you as an advantage. I'm a pro macro for when it comes to exams. I'm a pro micro when it comes to real life. I'm not a pro macro when it comes to the whole economy, because macroeconomy is in the hands of politicians who are not the best choices to begin with. Anyways, can't pass any political statements on my recorded lectures. Let's move on to discuss 3B. Okay, let me read 3B for you guys. Discuss whether mergers between firms always operate against consumer interests. So, guys, uh, you don't get the long run part. Why are you not getting the long run part? Let me just do the long run part for you for monopoly. For monopoly, for example, long run part may still have the same implication because the demand curve is let's say downward sloping. This is my MR, right? But this is my marginal cost. MC equals to MR happens here. Q naught price is P naught. Now, guys, if this is your ATC, you are making a loss, right? And if this is long run, you will not continue to produce because short run might have a situation of ABC, but long run may not have this kind of a situation, right? So in the long run, you will be like, it's better to shut down producing when your price is less than ATC because all costs are available. In the long run, Abbas is saying supernormal profits can be made in the long run only in the, I mean, there is a possibility, yes, but even in imperfect competition, you can make a loss. What about supernormal profits? You can make a supernormal profit if you are under imperfect competition. I haven't denied that, but you can also make a loss. The problem is that what's the role of ATC in this situation? The role of ATC, of course, is that in the long run, it will help you decide whether you stay in the business or you shut down and move on, because that's what happens. Got it? So ATC's got a point for us because the ATC will tell us whether we should produce in the long run or not. Are we going to move on? Guys, 3B. Okay, discuss whether mergers between, so basically this is a question about pros and cons of monopoly. Okay. ABC is going to impact survival in the short run. The role of ABC will be important, but in the long run, ATC will be exactly. In the short run, ABC will tell us whether we should continue to produce or not. In the long run, ATC will matter. Exactly. Good job, Abbas. But this is more about the ATC question that they were asking. There was an ABC question we also did a few days back. Okay, guys, mergers basically means monopoly. Okay, when you become merger, you're forming a monopoly. What are the pros and cons of monopoly? Let's look at the, and basically this is straight from the notes because we had a discussion about monopoly and public interest. Okay, so what are the advantages? There is, let's talk about disadvantages first. We talk about disadvantages. The first disadvantage that we talk about is the fact that whenever you have a monopoly, you are looking at, let's take it easy, shortcuts, X inefficiency should come later, but talk about allocative inefficiency, right? So we talk about how monopoly is producing, this is my demand curve, this is my marginal cost. We are looking at a case, MR is like this, MC equals to MR, we're producing at Q naught, price is P naught, right? So we're looking at a situation where you are looking at a situation. Just give me 1 minute, guys. Sorry, guys. P naught, at P naught, guys, what happens is this, that you are looking at, if this is what the point is, now look at this, this is MC equals to MR. Now, if this same market was under perfect competition, then they would produce at the point where P equals to MC, which would mean that this becomes my deadweight loss. So perfect competition produces at PC, quantity could be QC. So not only monopoly charges a higher price, but also produces a lower quantity. And that's why there is a deadweight loss that happens equals to area A, B, C or triangle ABC. So monopoly is not uh, allocatively efficient as a result of this. So first you talk about the idea that monopoly is allocatively inefficient. Then you talk about even it's productively inefficient. Uh, exactly, Abbas, you've done a good job in terms of helping me put the points across. The productive inefficiency of monopoly is the idea that productive efficiency happens when you produce at the lowest point of the ATC. It's not necessarily true. The monopoly produces at this point. Why? Because monopoly would produce at a point where MC equals to MR. They don't really care about producing at the lowest point. Under perfect competition, you are automatically allocatively efficient. So again, from the perspective of productive efficiency, you don't see that happening. The third we talked about was something which Shaukat also pointed out and Abbas is also pointing out, which is X inefficiency, right? Guys, sorry, can you guys hear me? Okay, somehow it just said I was muted, but that could be an old message. Sorry. And X inefficiency is simply the idea that you are inefficient because of or lack of competition making us inefficient, right? We don't produce at the lowest possible cost. That could be another downside. Then we can talk about the idea that, from a perspective of a monopoly, uh, you can have consumer exploitation through, yeah, one could argue price discrimination and so on. But let's talk about the advantage. The first advantage we want to talk about is this, that monopoly has a possibility of economies of scale. And I made this diagram. I want to draw this diagram one more time. I said this, if this is my demand curve, right? Let's just draw a linear demand curve. And this is my MR. Now, perfect competition has this demand supply curve, which is also marginal cost under perfect competition. So they produce at price PC and the quantity is QC. For monopoly, if it enjoys economies of scale, they may have a lower cost. So their price will be much lower. Sorry, this should be here. Their price will be much lower than perfect competition. So one could argue this, the monopoly can have economies of scale, which perfect competition cannot have. Make sense, guys? Yeah, there's a larger plant, centralized administration, and so on and so forth, right? Then they have funds available for research and development. They have reasons to innovate, to stay a market leader. And we talk that as your dynamic efficiency. They also want to keep the cost low. In order to maximize uh, profits. Make sense, guys? Any questions? So we talk about the pros and cons here. Guys, any questions before we move on? Okay, great. Awesome. Let's move on. Are we good to move on? Okay, guys. So 3A and B was good. I mean, if you are somebody who's preparing micro, you should go ahead and do that. I wanted to quickly discuss 5 also. Analyze the causes of unemployment. So we talk about equilibrium, disequilibrium unemployment, talk about the causes could be most significant for your country. Developing country can suffer from primarily, one would argue this, structural unemployment. Unemployment is a very important topic, popular topic. It will come. I would want you guys to prepare and so on. Okay. So talk about causes of unemployment, talk about probably most significant is structural unemployment in a developing country like Pakistan. Uh, for evaluation for this one, uh, uh, somebody is saying, Zainab, you are talking about the pros and cons. So this is an evaluation. So you can talk about how a merger can have an advantage in terms of providing a monopoly. If it's a monopoly that is providing benefits such as economies of scales and all that, but if it's an exploitative monopoly which results in higher price, it will have deadwood losses and not good desirable for society. Oh, okay. Unemployment part A doesn't have any evaluation then up. We don't write part A is a analyze question, not a discuss question. So here you don't need to. Okay. Part B is where we need to talk about evaluation. No, it will, Khalid, it will depend on, Khalid, it will depend on not the objective of monopoly, but the behavior of monopoly. Does that make sense, Khalid? Whether the monopoly is socially desirable or not depends on its behavior. Okay, sorry guys, quickly, 5A is easy. So talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium unemployment. Within equilibrium unemployment, talk about structural, frictional, seasonal. Within disequilibrium unemployment, talk about demand deficient or cyclical and real wage unemployment. And then talk about probably structural unemployment to be, or even disequilibrium kind of unemployment to be more prevalent in your country. 4 and 6 are bad questions. Just because they're 25 marks, no, they're not that bad. Okay, let me quickly get this out of the way. Discuss whether supply side policies are the most appropriate way. Now, guys, let's look at quickly B part. So whether supply side policy is a good way to most appropriate for reducing unemployment. You can talk about then that when you look at unemployment, there is disequilibrium and equilibrium, right? For disequilibrium unemployment, we do demand side policies, right? Basically changing AD because they can be solved through demand side. For equilibrium unemployment, we do supply side policies. And the reason why supply side policies are preferred basically for equilibrium unemployment because they work in the long run. They can basically do not have any trade-off with other policy goals like inflation and so on. So that is an advantage. Also, they don't contradict with other, exactly, that's what I wrote. But then we talk about also the idea that when you look at supply side policies, we do need to talk about the idea that demand side policies are more appropriate in the short run, right? But this is long run, but they're also expensive to conduct because, we're looking at, like training, education, and laws, regulation, and so on and so forth. So there are these kind of things. And for disequilibrium unemployment, they can also work in the long run if you want to sort of sort that problem. But the biggest problem is that if you use demand side policies for equilibrium unemployment, you will only end up causing inflation to rise. So they're appropriate for demand side policies are not appropriate for equilibrium unemployment. So you do need to mention that that equilibrium unemployment cannot be, we cannot, let me write this, solve it through demand side policies like fiscal and monetary policy. Okay, so these are some of the points. So we'll talk about what is supply side policy. We'll talk about why disequilibrium employment. Yeah, exactly, Nehru. Exactly, Saad. Remember, we talked about this, that we talked about the idea. This is your long run Phillips curve. This is your short run Phillips curve. This is your U star. If you decide to lower your unemployment through demand side policies, you may do so in the short run. This is inflation rate. But in the long run, inflation will rise. So you will go from A to B. And also we will come back to the same level on a new Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve, short-term Phillips curve will shift to the right. So on my y-axis, I have my inflation rate. On my x-axis, I have my unemployment rate. Well, you need to mention the long-run Phillips curve, Sheikh Ahmed. You do need to mention about the idea that supply side policies can only work in the long run and not in the short run. So whether they are the most appropriate policy for reducing unemployment, you need to see both short run, long run. You need to see if it's a demand side, if it's a disequilibrium unemployment or equilibrium unemployment, and you need to see also that equilibrium unemployment, they are probably the only way to go forward. Guys, does that make sense? Are we good? So what's the evaluation here? And the answer would be talking about that for the summary of this is that for equilibrium, always supply side policy. For disequilibrium, demand side policies can work. Yep, Abbas, that's very good. Okay, guys, let's look at 7. Somebody was saying 7 is a good question. So explain why GDP is widely used as a measure of economic growth and standard of living. So it's a why question. Kindly also discuss question number 4. Yes, we will. Arsalan, we will. Don't worry about that. We'll run and we'll make sure we do. Labor market is a topic that I strongly feel about, so that now everyone knows the labor market comes and an examiner has started to not test us on labor market that much or make it very challenging as a question. So it used to be our insurance policy, but now somehow they have started to sort of make it a little bit more challenging. Is there content less for just part A? For part A, which one? This one? 7A? Is that what you're talking about, Nadeem? 7A? So we talk about what is GDP, gross domestic product. We talk about how GDP is a measure of total value of the output. So for example, we talk about, we normally use real GDP per capita purchasing power parity adjusted to look at a country's sort of economic growth and standard of living. Economic growth, remember, is a change in your GDP over time. And GDP is basically looking at the total output, which can also be a signal of our standard of living, because the standard of living, although may depend on many other things, but output may also be considered. Higher output can lead to higher standard of living. Now, Ahmed is perfectly, so how do we measure GDP? Something Abbas, I don't know whether we can mention this here, because they're not really asking us. They're asking us what is GDP. They're asking us about what is economic growth. I can talk about one thing I can talk about is that when you look at economic growth, there is one thing we can mention about economic growth because they've mentioned economic growth. So I will talk about economic growth as actual versus potential. Okay, actual is basically when you are, if this is your LRAS and this is your AD and AS, so a rise in AD, this is your actual growth, right? And potential growth will be a shift of the LRAS, right? So I do, I should mention about what is economic growth and basically how economic growth makes sense. So this is something you can add, and also talk about standard of living is a measure of basically not only because the next part talks about discuss why alternative GDP are increasingly used. So we talk about problems of GDP as a measure of uh, as a measure. What are the problems of GDP as a measure of standard of living? But thing is, this question usually comes as a 20 combined 25 marks, but that we have enough to write. Is GDP the best measure of SOL? No, not really. Abbas, trust me, I've been teaching this for many years. Sometimes they may give you a 25 mark question. Sometimes they may give you this in two parts. So no, I would say discuss alternatives to GDP are increasingly. So we talk about problems of GDP. Number one, we talk about, could we discuss GNP in part B? So no, listen, Ahad. So what we need to do is first talk about what are the limitations. We talk about limitation as non-marketed items. First of all, GDP does not measure all the output. Why? Because it does not take into account the non-marketed items, the public sector outcome, and the quality of goods and services. Right. Then, even if it does account for these, it is also not taking into account any externalities. We also talk about how production may not always equal to consumption. It does take into account production, but that's not consumption, and consumption leads to higher standard of living. It does not consider what we call distribution of income. Exactly, Ibrahim. It also misses out on quality and so on and so forth. As a result of that, we need to rely on alternative measures like Human Development Index, which not only looks at GDP per capita, but also looks at your your literacy rates and your uh, health indicators through um, your survival rates, right? Then we look at other measures like, for example, MEW and so on. No, it does not require us to a detailed description of it, but a couple of lines may be useful. Talk about HDI in a broader picture, measures three things. MEW looks at basically things that are otherwise missed out, like crime rate, like quality of life, and so on and so forth. Got it? But this question actually does talk about all the problems that we measure of GDP as a measure of welfare. Okay. Part A does have little to write. So I'll talk about what is GDP, what is economic growth, how is economic growth different in terms of actual versus potential, um, and how GDP, the common sort of measure is GDP per capita, purchasing power parity. Just to talk about per capita, we look at the population, purchasing power parity, we look at the cost of living, and real would mean it would take into account inflation. Okay. Now moving on, I want to talk about now the labor market question. Since somebody was asking number 4, the wages of the chief executive CEO of the 6 largest banks in the US were reported to be between 250 and 360 times the average wage of the workers in those banks. 250 to 360 times. That's awesome. The 6 CEOs were all male. That's sad. talks about the male domination in the labor market. It discusses the extent to which economic theory can account for these variation in wages. So, guys, this is a 25-mark question. It talks about both the things, how are wages determined, basically, number one, but also it talks about your wage. Cedar, you are right. Cedar also has a very male dominant faculty and even ownership. You're right about that. Sumit, you're so right to point out, but let's not put this point in public. Miss Aisha is the principal, yes, but the ownership and the teaching faculty. So yeah, sorry, let's go back, come back to our point. Sumit is here to just distract us, right, Sumit? Okay, guys. So we talk about first. Remember, in all of these questions, this is a 25-mark question. I will first talk about how are wages determined in a perfectly competitive market, and we talk about the MRP theory. We talk about demand and supply, and we talk about that in a perfectly competitive market, without assumptions, everyone will be paid the same. However, this may not be true in real life. The case in point that is being asked, somebody's asking a question. If I want to start macro from scratch now, should I will answer that question in 1 minute. What should be my approach? Your approach from scratch is scary, my anon friend. But I would say the best way to go about is that I don't know. I guess the best thing to do is read chapter 5, 6, 7, 8 for macro from my notes. Okay. 5, 6, 7, 8 from my notes. I would say that first, and then you go back to 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my advice. Okay, sorry, coming back. Then we talk about, guys, the 6 CEOs that are whatever CEOs are paid much more because of many reasons. This one reason is primarily because of what we call non-competing groups. The one that we talked about, how um, janitors versus CEO kind of a salary would be because although you may a janitor may know CEO is paid so many times more, but it is primarily because of these differences due to human capital or expertise that people are paid differently. Isn't that true? So that could be one reason. So do you think there's enough to write? There is a lot to write. So you talk about first that, then you talk about discrimination could also be a reason because women were sort of sidelined. Talk about educational differences. So you're writing about wage differentials that are taking place in this. Now, you can also talk about the fact that there could also be market imperfection because it could be a problem because here it's all about wage differential and perfectly competitive market. We do need to, MRP theory, by the way, is a must whenever you look at perfectly, whenever you're talking about perfect competition. So if you ask me, 12 marks will be given for the fact that you are talking about perfect competition, MRP theory, and so on. How are wages determined in perfectly competitive market? Then the 13 marks will be given for why are wages different for the CEOs and what are the possible reasons why wage differential takes place. Make sense? Monopsony and trade union case wouldn't fit here exactly, and the reason is simply because it's not about the firm not paying less because its firms are paying different to different people because of either skills, either discrimination, either educational background, and so on. Productivity could be different, and that could also be a reason, and so on. Got it? And the most important case to mention, remember in our notes, we talk about non-competing groups where some people are paid more than the others. Demand is inelastic, supply is inelastic, and therefore wages are much higher than, let's say, somebody else who's easily replaceable, and the skill sets are low, and so on. Got it, guys? Are we good? So, case number 1, MRP theory, wage differential will come here as a discussion. when you're talking about, sorry, somebody says when you're talking about Abbas, when you're talking about your labor market differential, you'll need to talk about this diagram also. So you talk about, remember we talked about, I don't know whether you are in my class, but remember we have a diagram in our notes where we talk about, this is my demand for labor, or MRP. This is my supply of labor, right? Supply is inelastic, and the wage could be W1, Q1. So your economic rent is more than your transfer earning. But for an unskilled worker, demand is like this, supply is like this, wage is W1, Q1, so economic rent transfer. To talk about this also, right? You need to properly talk about these cases. Saad just mentioned, yes. Do we mention pi? Wage determination perfect. We do mention wage determination in perfect competition. This isn't my friend Madia. The reason why you talk about wage determination in perfect competition is primarily because you want to make a case that if this was perfect competition, nobody will be paid differently. And talk about what is perfect competition. But because people are paid differently, this means we are in imperfect competition. And then talk about why are we in imperfect competition? What are the reasons and so on. Does that make sense? Is the screen frozen? Not frozen. Yes. Left one is for CEO, right one is for that. What's the length? I don't know. Sometimes, guys, can I give you one piece of advice which can be very useful for you? And this is coming from a teacher who's teaching economics for many, many years. You want to listen to that advice and promise me you will follow? Will you follow that advice? I will only give it if you tell me you will follow. Experience flex. Ahmed, you're funny. Okay, the advice is do not worry about the length of the answer. Look at the quality of your answer. And there is one reality. If you are extremely well prepared, you know exactly what to write. And when you know exactly what to write, you will not write little, you will write exactly what is needed. And if it turns out to be not that much, it's okay. Examiner doesn't want you to fill sheets after sheets after sheets, because he knows that there will be a question that you'll choose which might not have too much to write, but that is what it is. Because if you look at 2 hours 15 minutes, you have a 30, you have a data response, you have 2 essay questions, you have a lot to write anyways. So examiner does want to basically does want to give you some respite. Yes, the quality matters over quantity. Make sense? Are we good? So that's my piece of advice. Okay, we want to look at A, because A seems to be like a very popular kind of a question. They are testing us about a lot about, like productive and allocative efficiency, economic efficiency. So 2A is explain the relationship between the pollution created by industrial production and economic efficiency. Now, guys, remember, pollution is what we call negative externality, and I want to draw the diagram here. Pollution is what we can say a production side of externality. So I will draw this kind of a diagram. I'll talk about, this is my demand, right? This is my supply. If there is pollution, then this price and quantity may not be socially desirable. Production should be much lower, like S dash. And as a result of this, the price should be high and the quantity should be low. This is your marginal private cost. This is your marginal social cost, which is private cost, plus externality, if it's a production side of externality. Okay, so talk about negative externality, where what is negative externality? This is a third party cost where marginal cost is private cost is basically more than the social cost, and as a result, the production should be less and price should be higher. And that's why, what kind of a market failure is this? We call it an allocative inefficiency. Why? Because you're not producing the right quantities, you are over provisioning the good, right? So we talk about this in terms of allocative inefficiency. We talk about this diagram. We also talk about the deadweight loss that happens. Triangle A, B, C is the deadweight loss that will take place because of this. Somebody saying some market failure and efficiency are the most important topic. I went through the past papers from 1621, and I think it's a very important micro topic. Abbas said that you have just said something similar to what I feel. It is a question the examiner are giving these days, primarily because they do want to sort of make sure that you do know about efficiency. And given the market failure has now moved away from AS economics, that's why it's very likely to come in your exams as well. Okay, so you talk about allocative efficiency, talk about basically negative externality, talk about divergence between social costs and private costs, and so on. Now, B part is using diagram, discuss whether the policies employed by the government to reduce allocative inefficiency is always effective. Now, guys, what are the policies that can help us to reduce this? Well, the most famous and common one is indirect taxation, right? But you could also basically do laws and regulation. That's the second one. You could also put a quota, make sure the quantity becomes Q1, right? You just let the quantity to become Q1, let's call it quota, right? Or you could also do some kind of a pricing control for this, or pollution permits. Exactly, that's a great one. Pollution permits could also be. In this case, awareness also works very well, because negative externality that happens, if you let people know about the harm to the society, maybe they can stop, but doubt that will work. Then they talking about using diagrams, discuss whether policy. So you talk about the diagram of how, same diagram that I did draw, but I'll also draw a diagram for taxation. If this is my demand and supply, your S1 will be your marginal social cost, which is also marginal private cost plus your tax amount. So this becomes your tax amount, and the government makes P0 minus P1 as your total tax revenue, but the quantity will become Q1, which will be socially desirable. So rather than producing P0, Q0, we will produce less and charge more. Let's call it P1 and P2. So nudge theory is a way to persuade people, which informational techniques. I mean, so nudge may not be blatant as an information campaign. So a nudge, by the name of it, is kind of like done in a manner that you don't feel, but by giving information, you are actually providing more of a blatant kind of information. Got it? Let's talk about evaluation of this. So there are many evaluations of this. Number one, government may not know the size of the externality, and they may under or over tax, or for example, under or over control the quantity. We can also talk about indirect taxes. If you put them, they are regressive in nature. Exactly. They are also, as a result, cause inequality to go up. Also, Government lack of knowledge may not make government the right kind of a party to to put the policy in place. So that could also be a challenge. And lastly, like somebody mentioned about, probably information dissemination could be a great way to go forward, but behavioral change could also be important. Very good, Abbas. You can talk about how government can sometimes be politically motivated and they may or may not want to do the right policy for people. So these are all the great evaluations that you guys are pointing out. Now, I left one question. Let's just go back to this one also. Investment by multinational corporations in a developing country always promotes sustainable economic growth in that country. So I would really don't want to do this question, but if I was doing this question, I would talk about how investment and multipliers interlinked. Role of MNCs is in the notes. So you talk about what are the roles of various MNCs. They fill the saving gap. They provide expertise and so on and so forth. So talk about role of MNCs, talk about how investment and multiplier and GDP is interrelated, and then talk about what is economic growth and for sustainable economic growth. Why do you? But again, this is a very open-ended question because you need to plug in many concepts to make this as a compelling answer. So yeah, this is one question that I would say I would rather not want to do as a student because I'd be like, I have so many questions that are close-ended. I would rather want to do them first. I agree, Abbas. Economic growth, and if you don't like developing economics, maybe skip that part of it. Guys, we're done. Thank you very much. I'm going to put a recording of this class, and inshallah, today is Wednesday. We were supposed to meet on Friday next, so we'll meet on Friday. Okay. Okay, guys. Sumit, you have a question?